China is secretly building the largest underground oil reserve system in human history, and almost nobody is talking about it. Carved into mountains, buried beneath coastlines, and hidden from satellite detection, these caverns can hold hundreds of billions of dollars worth of crude oil. We're talking about enough oil to keep the world's second-largest economy running for months, completely cut off from the rest of the world. You heard that right. And the speed at which China's building this network tells you everything about what it believes is coming. Now, to understand why China is doing this, you first need to understand just how exposed it really is. You might assume that a nation as powerful as China has its energy situation locked down. But the truth is far more uncomfortable than that. China imports over 70% of all the crude oil it consumes. Every factory running, every car moving, every military vehicle fueled, more than 2/3 of that energy comes from somewhere else, from someone else. And that dependency isn't shrinking, it's growing every single year as China's economy expands and its appetite for oil deepens. But here's where it gets dangerous. Almost all of that imported oil travels through one place, a narrow strip of water between Malaysia and Indonesia called the Strait of Malacca. At its tightest point, this strait is less than 2 miles wide. 2 miles. You heard that right. The entire energy supply of the world's most populous nation, the fuel that runs its factories, its military, its cities, passes through a choke point so narrow you could almost throw a stone across it. And China doesn't control it. The United States Navy does. This is what keeps Chinese military planners awake at night. In any serious conflict, over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over anything, the US and its allies could close that strait. No ships get through. No oil gets through. And within weeks, China's industrial engine begins to choke. Its military loses its fuel advantage. Its economy starts seizing up. And its government faces something it fears more than any foreign army, a restless, angry population that can no longer be kept comfortable. That vulnerability has a name inside Chinese strategic circles. They call it the Malacca Dilemma, and it has been driving Chinese foreign and military policy for 2 decades. But now, China has decided that diplomacy and naval expansion aren't enough. It needed something deeper, something hidden, something that no blockade, no sanction, and no enemy fleet could ever touch. And that's exactly what it started building beneath the ground. What China studied before it started digging. Before China put a single drill in the earth, it watched. It studied every major energy crisis in modern history, and it took notes that would make most governments uncomfortable. Because what China learned wasn't just about oil. It was about how energy can be used as a weapon, and what happens to a nation that gets caught without a shield. The lesson that hit hardest came from 1973. When Arab oil-producing nations cut off supply to the United States and Western Europe, the result was chaos. Gas lines stretched for miles. Factories shut down. Governments teetered. Economies that looked invincible were suddenly on their knees. Not because of bombs or invasions, but because of a pipeline turned off. That single event changed everything. It proved that whoever controls the energy supply controls the outcome of almost any conflict, economic or military. The United States responded by building the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, the largest emergency oil stockpile on Earth, buried in salt caverns deep beneath Louisiana and Texas. Over 700 million barrels, tucked underground where no enemy could reach it. China saw that and began calculating. If the world's most powerful nation felt it needed that kind of insurance, what did that say about everyone else? But China didn't just want what America had. It wanted something bigger, something more hidden, and something that could survive not just a supply disruption, but a full-scale military confrontation. The US Reserve was a buffer. What China envisioned was a fortress. And the moment it decided to stop studying and start building, the scale of what it was planning would shock the world if the world had been paying attention. But almost no one was. What China is actually building beneath the earth. This is where the story stops being about strategy and starts being about something almost incomprehensible in scale. What China has constructed, and is still constructing, beneath its mountains, coastlines, and plains, is not a storage facility. It is an underground civilization built entirely around one resource, and the engineering required to pull it off is unlike anything attempted in the history of energy infrastructure. There are two primary methods China is using. The first involves salt caverns, massive underground chambers formed by dissolving salt deposits deep in the earth, then using the hollow space to store crude oil under pressure. These caverns can hold tens of millions of barrels each. They're naturally sealed, and they're nearly impossible to destroy from above. The second method involves hard rock caverns, tunnels and chambers blasted and carved directly into granite mountain ranges, reinforced, pressurized, and connected by underground pipelines that run for miles without ever surfacing. Key facilities have been identified at Zhoushan on the eastern coast, Huangdao in the north, Dushanzi deep in Xinjiang, and a growing network of sites along China's western mountain ranges, locations chosen specifically because they are far from coastlines where a naval strike could reach them. Some of these sites sit beneath more than 1,000 feet of solid rock. You heard that right. 1,000 feet of mountain above the oil, between the fuel supply and anything an enemy could throw at it. And the capacity targets China has set are staggering. Early phase goals push toward 500 million barrels. But analysts tracking satellite imagery, construction activity, and Chinese energy policy documents now believe the long-term target exceeds 90 days of total import coverage, which at China's current consumption rate means storing well over 1 billion barrels of crude. That is nearly 1.5 times the entire U.S. Strategic Petroleum Reserve, hidden almost entirely underground. But the scale of what's being built is only half the story. The other half is what China has gone out of its way to make sure you never find out about it. The secrecy that makes this more dangerous than you think. Most nations that hold strategic petroleum reserves report their numbers. It's standard practice. The International Energy Agency tracks reserve levels across member countries, and that transparency keeps global oil markets stable. When a supply shock hits, markets can calculate how long the world can hold out, and that calculation prevents panic. China knows this, and China has decided that the last thing it wants is for anyone to know how much oil it's sitting on. China reports some reserve data to international bodies, but the numbers it submits and the numbers that independent analysts estimate are worlds apart. Satellite imagery firms, energy research groups, and intelligence analysts have spent years trying to reconcile what China claims with what they can observe from orbit. The gap is enormous. Construction activity at known and suspected reserve sites far outpaces anything the official figures would justify. Pipelines are being laid to facilities that, according to Chinese data, barely exist. Underground infrastructure is expanding in regions where Beijing has said almost nothing publicly. And that silence is deliberate. Because when you don't know how much oil China has stored, you can't calculate how long it can hold out in a conflict. You can't determine at what point sanctions start to bite. You can't know whether an energy blockade would work in weeks, or whether China could simply wait you out for a year while your own economy absorbs the pressure of a prolonged standoff. That uncertainty is a weapon, and China is wielding it with precision. But the secrecy isn't just about military leverage. It's also about market power. When China wants to buy oil, it buys quietly and in volume. When it wants to release reserves to cool domestic prices, it does so without telegraphing its moves. No nation can predict its behavior. No market can price in its intentions. And that unpredictability gives China an economic edge that money alone cannot buy. But understanding why China built this system is only part of what you need to know. The real question, the one that changes everything, is why China suddenly started building faster than anyone expected. Why China suddenly started building faster? For years, China's underground reserve program moved at a steady but measured pace. Then, something happened that changed everything. In February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and within days, the United States and its European allies did something that sent shockwaves through every government on Earth that wasn't already aligned with Washington. They didn't just sanction Russia, they froze it. They cut Russian banks off from the global financial system, seized Russian assets held in Western institutions, and systematically targeted the energy revenues that kept the Russian economy alive. China watched every single move. And what it saw wasn't just a punishment being handed to Russia. It was a demonstration. A live demonstration of exactly how the Western financial and energy system could be turned into a weapon against any nation that challenged it. Russia had oil. Russia had gas. Russia had nuclear weapons. And it was still being brought to its knees through economic suffocation. If that could happen to Russia, the calculation inside Beijing was immediate and visceral. It could happen to China too. Construction timelines that had been measured in decades were suddenly being compressed into years. Facilities that were in planning phases got fast-tracked. Funding that had been allocated over long budget cycles got front-loaded. The urgency wasn't theoretical anymore. China had just watched its worst nightmare play out in real time against its closest strategic partner, and the message was unmistakable. Then came the piece that made the acceleration feel existential. Tensions over Taiwan began escalating to levels not seen in decades. U.S. naval activity in the South China Sea intensified. Wargame scenarios that had once lived in academic papers started appearing in mainstream policy discussions. And every single one of those scenarios included the same move in the opening hours: a naval blockade. Cut off the Strait of Malacca. Starve China of oil. Wait. China decided it was done waiting to be ready. But the reserves aren't just a defensive shield. What most people miss entirely is how China plans to use this stockpile as an offensive economic weapon, and that changes the entire picture. The weapon that doesn't fire bullets. Here is something that almost nobody outside of energy policy circles fully understands. A strategic petroleum reserve isn't just a backup tank. In the hands of a government willing to use it aggressively, it becomes one of the most powerful economic weapons ever devised. And China has built its underground network with exactly that kind of offensive capability in mind. When global oil prices spike because of a conflict, a supply disruption, or a market panic, every oil-dependent economy feels the pain immediately. Fuel costs rise, inflation accelerates, and governments face impossible choices between subsidizing energy and letting their populations absorb the shock. That pressure can destabilize governments. It can trigger recessions. It can force nations into policy decisions they would never otherwise make. China, with its massive underground reserve, can simply release oil into its own domestic market and insulate itself from all of it. While your economy is bleeding, China's keeps running. But it goes further than that. China can also flood regional markets with released reserves at strategic moments, suppressing prices in ways that hurt oil-exporting nations it wants to pressure, or stabilizing prices for nations it wants to reward. It can coordinate releases with allies to amplify the effect. It can time those releases to coincide with moments of maximum geopolitical leverage. In a world where energy is currency, China is quietly building the largest vault on Earth, and it alone holds the key. And then there's the domestic dimension, which for the Chinese Communist Party may matter most of all. The CCP's grip on power rests on one unspoken contract with its population: deliver prosperity, deliver stability, and the people will accept the arrangement. The moment fuel prices spiral, food distribution chains break down, and factory workers lose income, that contract fractures. The underground reserves are, at their core, a tool for keeping that contract intact, no matter what the outside world throws at China. They are as much about political survival as they are about military strategy. This is no longer just an energy story. This is a story about a nation methodically constructing the ability to survive and operate in complete independence from a global system it no longer fully trusts. And what that means for the rest of the world is something you need to sit with. The world China is preparing for. You are living through the early stages of a fundamental fracture in the global order. The system of interconnected trade, shared financial infrastructure, and mutual energy dependency that defined the last 70 years is cracking. China sees it. And unlike most nations, which are still trying to preserve that system, China is quietly building the infrastructure to exist outside of it. The underground oil network is one pillar. but it sits alongside a food stockpile program that has made China the holder of more than half the world's corn reserves and over 60% of its wheat reserves. It sits alongside a rare earth monopoly that gives China control over materials critical to every advanced weapons system and clean energy technology on Earth. It sits alongside a semiconductor self-sufficiency drive, a domestic payment system designed to bypass the US dollar, and a military expansion program operating on a timeline measured in years, not decades. Every single one of these programs points toward the same conclusion. China is not preparing for a trade dispute. It is not preparing for a diplomatic standoff. It is preparing for a world in which the global supply chains, financial systems, and energy networks that nations depend on can no longer be trusted because in a serious conflict, they will be weaponized. And China intends to be the one nation that can absorb that weaponization and keep functioning. The underground oil reserves are the most visceral expression of that preparation. Because oil isn't just fuel. Oil is the difference between an economy that operates and one that stops. Between a military that advances and one that stalls. Between a government that holds power and one that collapses under the weight of its own people's desperation. China has spent decades watching what happens when nations run out of it, and it has made a decision that no blockade, no sanction, no embargo, and no enemy fleet will ever put it in that position. Hundreds of feet beneath Chinese soil, in caverns carved out of solid rock, sits the most consequential insurance policy ever assembled. And the clock on, when it might be needed, is no longer measured in generations. It is measured in years. The engineering no one is supposed to know about. You don't build something this large without solving problems that have never been solved before. The engineering behind China's underground reserve network is, in its own right, one of the most ambitious construction programs in human history, and almost none of it has ever been publicly documented in full detail. Salt cavern storage sounds simple until you understand what it actually requires. You drill down hundreds of feet, inject fresh water to dissolve the salt formation, then pump the resulting brine out until you've created a sealed underground chamber the size of a cathedral. Then you pressurize it, line the access shafts, connect it to a surface terminal via insulated underground pipelines, and repeat that process dozens of times across a single facility. Each cavern can hold millions of barrels. Each facility clusters dozens of caverns together. And China has built multiple facilities of this scale simultaneously, at a pace that has left energy infrastructure analysts struggling to keep up. The hard rock caverns are even more extraordinary. Carved directly into granite mountain ranges using controlled explosives and precision boring equipment, these chambers are engineered to withstand not just time and pressure, but deliberate attack. The rock above them absorbs blast force, the depth makes aerial bombardment useless, and the internal pressure systems ensure that even a partial structural breach doesn't trigger a catastrophic release. These aren't storage tanks with a mountain on top. They are purpose-engineered military-grade vaults that happen to hold oil. But here is the part that makes this more than an engineering story. The pipelines connecting these facilities run underground for hundreds of miles, linking coastal import terminals to inland storage sites in a network that can reroute flow if any single node is compromised. Destroy one terminal, the oil keeps moving. Block one pipeline, the network redirects. The redundancy built into this system is not the redundancy of a civilian energy project. It is the redundancy of a system designed to survive a war. And the construction is not finished. Satellite analysts tracking earthwork activity, pipeline laying, and heavy equipment movement at dozens of sites across China estimate that the network is still expanding, quietly, continuously, and with an urgency that suggests the timeline driving it is not measured in decades. But the engineering is only part of what makes this system terrifying to China's adversaries. The other part is what China can do with it once a crisis actually begins. What happens when the world finally runs short? Picture the moment it all breaks open. A conflict erupts in the Taiwan Strait. The United States and its allies move to close the Strait of Malacca. Global oil markets go into immediate freefall. Prices spike, tanker routes collapse, and every nation that depends on Middle Eastern or Russian crude begins emergency rationing. Governments that spent years assuming the global energy system was stable suddenly discover it was only ever one crisis away from failure. And China? China opens the valves. While the rest of the world scrambles, China draws from reserves buried so deep and so dispersed that no military action can meaningfully disrupt them. Its factories keep running. Its military keeps moving. Its population keeps receiving fuel subsidies that prevent the kind of civil unrest that would otherwise force the government's hand. China doesn't just survive the shock, it operates through it. And every week that passes, the asymmetry grows. Nations without reserves begin making concessions. Economies without buffers begin contracting. Governments without options begin negotiating. This is the payoff China has been engineering for. Not a dramatic military victory, not a single decisive moment, but a slow, grinding demonstration that it can outlast any pressure campaign the outside world assembles against it. The underground reserves don't win a war in a day. They make China impossible to defeat through economic suffocation, which, as the past 2 decades have proven, is the weapon the West reaches for first. And here's the final thing you need to understand. China didn't build this system because it wants conflict. It built it because it studied every nation that was ever brought to its knees through energy starvation, and made a decision at the highest levels of its government that it would never be one of them. Beneath the mountains and coastlines of China, carved into rock that will outlast every current government on Earth, sits the answer to every blockade, every sanction, and every attempt to use energy as a weapon against it. The world built a system designed to keep China dependent. China built a vault designed to make that dependence irrelevant. And it did it quietly, beneath your feet, while the world was looking somewhere else.